Is the past fixed? Most people would claim that they don't believe in sense perception. And by that, they simply mean that they don't believe everything they see or some other such thing. But the real question of whether you believe in sense perception is whether your experience of the universe around you is that of a human being or that of an animal. The extent to which you believe that time is composed of moments is exactly the extent to which you do believe in sense perception. The idea that there is such a thing as a completely defined moment in and of itself, from which all future moments flow, sort of like dominoes, actually stems from the work of Isaac Newton and Laplace. In Newton's universe, everything is composed of the motions of little hard balls. They have positions, they have velocities, and they have forces which act on them. And if you know their positions, their velocities, and the forces which act on them at one moment in Newton's absolute time, then you know the forces, velocities, and the positions that constitute the next moment. In fact, every single moment which is to follow is contained in every moment which precedes it. Thus, the causality moves forward like dominoes. This is true for one ball with a velocity. It's true for two balls with a velocity, 3, 4, 5. Laplace extends this to make the entire universe mechanical. His moment contains the positions, velocities, and forces acting on all of these little hard balls which compose the entire universe. And thus, if you were a being, Laplace's demon, which could know those positions and velocities of every element in the universe at any given moment, you would be able to successfully predict the positions and arrangements at every single moment which was to follow. This is a universe which is strictly deterministic and leaves no room for human free will, no room for human creativity. But the sane person realizes that human creativity actually does exist in the universe. If so, the question is, how does it exist in the universe? Obviously, the space and time of Newton and Laplace are incompatible with the notion of real human creativity. But what sort of space and time is compatible with human creativity? Now, in fact, there are some very serious questions which have arisen in science which demand this sort of investigation to be able to tackle them. Most recently was the train wreck which occurred at the beginning of the 20th century with the development of so-called quantum mechanics. At that point, there was a move made by a number of lunatics in the guise of scientists to try and scrap the concept of causality altogether. Because what they said was that if they could not have their simple one-to-one domino causality, then nobody could have any causality. When presented with this argument near the end of his life, Einstein made the provocative point that, in fact, we have to eliminate the concept of domino causality because that's a kind of causality that looks like a beginner plunking out note after note on the piano with no sense of how they form a coherent whole and partially believing that each note is creating the note that follows. Whereas instead, what we're seeing in the quantum phenomena and all these phenomena in the very, very small is a type of causality that begins to look a lot more like the causality that we would see in a Bach fugue. When listening to a series of notes, for example, it's not the case that each note exists in a vacuum in and of itself. In fact, it's very hard to hear a sequence of notes and not connect them such that the note which follows has an effect on the note which precedes, changing its meaning by an action which operates seemingly backwards in time. If we were to try and draw this out on a timeline, this would mean that a state A, which ostensibly generates a state B, is then changed by the mere existence of that state B. At the same time, state B, descending from state A, generating a state C, is changing the preceding states B and A. This is to say nothing else than the fact that the note, if viewed as a moment in the musical space, is not the perfectly defined thing that Laplace states a moment in time actually is. Now, your inclination is to say, well, the past doesn't change. Your idea of the past changes. But the question immediately arises is, to what extent are you capable of really making that distinction? Is it true that the universe divides itself into something called fact and something else called idea? To begin with, we'll take a question looking at this exact same composition here, and we'll extend that to make an ontological point about the universe as a whole. What is the geometry of the space-time which your mind occupies? And is it the case that that space-time geometry is distinct from the space-time geometry of the so-called objective universe? Isn't it the case that that objective universe has to be organized such that it at least contains your mind? In fact, that universe is organized such that it is a perfect reflection of your mind. This, as we'll see, will also account for the fact that only that human mind is capable of understanding the processes which govern that universe. That is to say, the human mind, the individual human mind, and every individual human mind is the measure of that universe as a whole. That fact will tell us something about the ontological nature of that universe as a whole. Take a second now and reflect on what is actually happening within your mind. What sort of a geometry is being defined here? And obviously, we use geometry in the broadest sense of the word. As will become clear, this is not exactly something you can draw. In fact, the notion of geometry that applies here is not something that's capable of registering visually. There is no one thing called space or time or even space-time that exists independently of action. There are as many different things called time as there are processes of change. Now, the space-time geometry of a Bach fugue is not a geometry of music. The change that we feel, the motion that we feel when listening to a piece such as this, is the motion of our own mind. This change, this motion of our own mind, is what defines time. There are no fixed moments in this space-time. Every moment acts both backwards and forwards in time, transforming the character of every other, creating an idea which exists entirely outside of the sequence of notes. If we listen to this constant interplay of voices, this constant development of paradox and their resolution, and we decide to stop it at a specific location, we can see that in that moment, there is contained no discernible structure. Like the single note, but more pronounced, this moment is underdetermined, and its character is defined by the events which are to come. The ability of each successive note on that process to act on all that precede immediately requires us to scrap whatever notion we once had of linear clock time unfolding in a given direction. At the very least, this notion of time requires processes to be able to flow, requires causality to be able to flow in two directions at once. In fact, again, we have a situation where the voices manage to act on one another from different points in a much more complex musical space-time. And it's only across this entire complex musical space-time that you're capable of recognizing a whole as a whole, a single idea as an idea. So the idea must exist outside of the composition in such a way that it is capable of acting at every point on that composition at once. As further voices are introduced, the complexity of this space begins to unfold, and as you listen to it, you can almost sense the space-time in which that composition has to exist. The idea of sheet music is therefore misleading. Once we take this process and attempt to draw it out in visual space, can we identify where the idea exists in that melody? Is it in the first measure? The second measure? Maybe over here at the end? Or is it somewhere before? Obviously, this is a silly question. Nobody would seek to locate the idea behind a musical piece on the paper. But what is the characteristic of that space-time? And is it in fact distinct from what we know as the objective universe? Typically, this is treated, and quite correctly, as a theological question. If the universe is a created universe, we run into an interesting paradox. Does the creator of the universe exist before the universe that it creates? Now, at first, this might seem like it's an obvious question with an obvious answer. Of course, anything that creates anything else has to exist before the thing that it creates. I mean, it certainly can't exist after the thing that it creates, can it? But when we're talking about the universe and the creator of that universe, we run into serious problems. That is, if we say that any event exists before the universe, we're saying that it exists before the universe in time. This means that time exists before the event that creates the universe. That makes our creator not much of a creator. Now, we could put another creator prior to that time, responsible for creating that time, that creator, and that universe. But if it's before our old time, then it must be before our old time and some new time. We'd have to place another creator before that time, and another before that, before that, before that, and that quickly becomes ridiculous. We're faced with a different sort of relationship between the creator and the created universe, one that in fact looks a lot more like the relationship between the idea and the composition from which that idea unfolds. Now, is it a coincidence that this principle, which seems to be a principle solely of cognition, of creative human thought, is necessary to be brought to bear when discussing the universe as a whole? Is it any more of a coincidence that the only thing within that universe that's capable of even asking that question is the individual human mind? Is there some reason for this clear parallel between processes of creation in the small and in the very, very large? For us as individual human beings, we are very tempted to give ourselves a location in space and time. But this is an illusion of sense perception. From the standpoint of sense perception, we seem to occupy a tiny point in space and in time. That is to say, the actual volume we occupy, our body, compared to the size of the Earth, is rather tiny. But you take that now and compare that to the size of our entire solar system, and compare that to the size of our entire galaxy, and compare that to the size of the entire network of galaxies that might be a part of, and we seem very, very small indeed until we realize that that entire massive network has just been conceived by us, and as such is contained within our own mind, which makes us, on the contrary, very large. Relatively speaking, we are infinitely large, in fact. A similar condition holds for time. By that I mean, if you take the entire scope of the individual human life, from birth to death, and you compare that to the entirety of human history, we seem to occupy a rather insignificant stretch of time. But now, if you compare that entire stretch of recorded human history, some several thousand years, to the 2 to 3 million years in which cognition is known to exist in its singular expression on this planet, that entire stretch of human history seems rather tiny and insignificant, and we seem even tinier in comparison. But then you compare that to the several billions of years that life on our planet is supposed to have existed, and we seem incredibly tiny indeed, at least until we take a second and realize that that entire stretch of time, going as far back as we can imagine and extending an incredible distance into the future, in fact, as far as we're planning into the future, and we realize that that entire stretch is contained within our minds as a one, we realize that once again we're actually quite large. The human mind, and only the human mind, exists within the universe in such a way that the universe exists effectively within mind. That in fact all human activity which can truly be called human activity is mind acting lawfully on mind. Human ideas are not developed in isolation. They are developed in a process which Plato identified as the dialogue. The juxtaposition of two seemingly contradictory impressions to generate a paradox which must be resolved. This constant interplay of ideas is exactly that which we see in a several voice fugue. There is a difference between eternity and forever. When most people discuss life after death, they are conceiving of their life as a series of events, unfolded in time, and they're wondering whether that sequence will continue on after the death of their body. But in reality, immortality is something which happens much sooner. For instance, Joe Blow makes a discovery of principle. Joe Blow dies. But the principle, we say, lives on after. But where in reality was that principle before he died? An idea is immortal while the person lives. A universal principle has a location relative to the universe, which mirrors the location of a musical idea relative to the sequence of events in a composition. This outsideness of the process, this ability to exist outside of time, registers to the person who believes in time as a sort of forever. In reality, for the thing that exists outside of the sequence of events, it exists as a one, as a single concept which we might call eternity. In this way, immortality is something which occurs during the life of the individual. Now, this has a number of interesting consequences. The first is that we no longer have the distinction between so-called moral law and so-called physical law. We're no longer justified in making some artificial distinction between fact and idea. In fact, the relative truthfulness or untruthfulness of the ideas that we hold from a moral standpoint is directly expressed physically in the so-called objective universe. In this way, we begin to get a real ontological sense of what human immortality is. It's not some prize you're waiting for after your death. It's not some punishment that you face after dying. It's a state of mind in which you exist during the so-called course of your life. But as we see here, the effective course of your life, your efficient existence, is something that extends much more broadly than your physical existence. The active you, the efficient you, is something much more expansive than the space that your body occupies in space and in time. The space-time you has the same enfolding character as the process that's responsible for the creation of this universe. But now this notion of the creative human individual, this notion of the creative human mind not as some object within the universe, but as an object of the universe, this notion has major implications for the science of human economics. If, by human economics, we mean the activity of the aggregate of all human minds, not simply all human minds that exist at this present moment, but all human minds that have ever existed, and all human minds that will ever exist, to act within and upon that universe as a creative organizing force. In order to explore this idea more closely, we're now going to take a look at the works of Vladimir Ivanovich Vernadsky and his concepts of the biosphere and the noosphere.